The cold, persistent drip from the mine's ceiling was the only clock I acknowledged, its rhythm a morbid counterpoint to the quiet hum of my instruments. Here, in the hollowed-out belly of the abandoned mine, beneath 1,000 feet of granite and shale, I had found my sanctuary. The world above, with its ceaseless chatter and blinding light, held no appeal. Down here, the static of the cosmos was clearer, the ambient noise of humanity mercifully absent. My purpose, solitary and absolute, was to listen. For 3 years, this forgotten shaft had been my cathedral, a makeshift observatory carved from the Earth's indifference. My breath plumed faintly in the frigid air, each exhalation a ghost. The rough-hewn walls, slick with mineral-rich moisture, caught the glint of indicator lights, amber, emerald, a nervous flicker of crimson. My makeshift console, a sprawling web of salvaged screens and custom-built receivers, occupied the central cavern. I sought patterns, anomalies, the subtle signatures of cosmic events that eluded the surface arrays, those fragile instruments buffeted by atmospheric interference and terrestrial noise. My determination was an unyielding anchor in the vast, silent ocean of my work. Today, however, the familiar ebb and flow of cosmic background radiation felt different. I leaned closer to the primary monitor, my gaze tracing the jagged peaks and valleys of a new data visualization. It wasn't the usual white noise, nor the predictable pulse of a distant pulsar. This was something else. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through the cavern floor, a deep-seated vibration I'd learned to ignore, a ghost from the mine's industrial past. But today, it seemed to resonate with the strange signal on my screen. My fingers, calloused from years of fine calibration, danced across the holographic interface, isolating the segment. The waveform, usually chaotic or uniformly rhythmic, displayed an intricate, almost impossible structure. A nested complexity. I felt a prickle of unease, a sensation alien to my usually stoic disposition. This wasn't noise. It was too precise, too intentional. My mind, a labyrinth of equations and astrophysical theories, grappled with the implications. Deep space radio bursts, the source of this data, were inherently energetic, violent events. They didn't produce such delicate, self-similar patterns. It defied every known principle of celestial mechanics. Hours bled into days. My world shrank to the glowing screens, the rhythmic click of my keyboard, and the increasingly insistent presence of the anomaly. I ran filters, algorithms, cross-referenced databases. Every test confirmed the impossible. The pattern was real, embedded within the fabric of a distant burst originating billions of light-years away. It wasn't an artifact of my equipment. It was in the signal itself. The pattern wasn't just complex, it was ordered. It spoke of a design, a purpose, yet its nature was utterly alien. It was like finding a perfect, crystalline snowflake at the heart of a supernova. As I zoomed further into the waveform, layers revealed themselves. Each iteration of the pattern contained a smaller, identical echo of itself, infinitely regressing, yet subtly shifting. It was a language without words, a melody without notes, and it began to resonate not just with my instruments, but with something deeper within me. A faint, high-pitched whine started to emanate from the primary receiver, a sound I'd never heard it make before. It wasn't electrical interference, it was almost harmonic. The air in the cavern seemed to thicken, pressing in on me, not with the physical weight of the earth, but with an unseen presence. My skin crawled. The familiar isolation of the mine, once a comfort, now felt like a trap. The ancient timbers supporting the roof groaned, a sound as old as the mine itself, but now it sounded like a sigh. My own breath hitched. The anomaly wasn't just data on a screen anymore. It felt like it was listening back. My intellectual curiosity had been piqued, but a tremor of primal fear, a fear of the utterly unknown, had begun to root itself deep within my determined soul. The world above, with its ceaseless chatter and blinding light, felt a million years distant. My focus, sharp as a honed blade, was entirely on the faint, complex patterns blossoming across my monitors. The anomalous signal, my silent companion for weeks, now demanded a deeper communion. My fingers danced across the console, a practiced ballet of inputs and adjustments. Each line of code I wrote, each filter I applied, peeled back another layer of cosmic static, revealing the signal's intricate architecture. It wasn't a simple pulse, nor a chaotic burst, it was a symphony of nested frequencies, a language woven into the fabric of spacetime. I traced its contours, mapped its peaks and troughs, feeling a nascent understanding bloom in the quiet recesses of my mind. The air, thick with the scent of damp earth and ozone, seemed to vibrate with a latent energy, or perhaps that was just my own heightened awareness. My eyes, dry and aching, scanned the spectral graphs, searching for the repeating patterns I knew must exist. It was then, amidst the low thrum of the ventilation system, that I first heard it. It seemed to coil from the very stone walls, a sound too fine, too ephemeral to be real. I paused, my hand hovering over a dial. The mine was silent, save for the drip. I shook my head, attributing it to auditory fatigue, the brain playing tricks in the deep quiet. The granite, after all, was an ancient, groaning beast. I leaned closer to the screen, adjusting the gain on a particularly dense section of the signal. The patterns resolved into something almost symmetrical, an impossible geometry of waveforms. My breath hitched. This wasn't natural noise, it was structured, deliberate. It was gone before I could properly turn my head, a brief, inky smear against the rough-hewn rock. My heart gave a singular, heavy thud against my ribs. I rubbed my temples, the dull ache a familiar companion. The flicker, I rationalized, was merely a trick of the straining light, or perhaps a fragment of dust disturbed by the ventilation, catching the weak glow from my lamps. My mind, I told myself, was simply overworked, stretched thin by the relentless demands of this discovery. Sleep, when it finally claimed me, was less a descent into rest and more a reluctant surrender to exhaustion. Yet, the moment my eyes closed, the dreams began. They were not the usual jumble of daily anxieties, but vast, sprawling landscapes of impossible scale. I stood on a plain of obsidian glass, reflecting a sky not of stars, but of swirling, incandescent nebulae that pulsed with an unheard rhythm. Structures rose from the horizon, not buildings, but impossibly complex crystalline formations that defied Euclidean logic, twisting and turning into themselves, their surfaces shifting with a myriad of unseen colors. A profound sense of insignificance washed over me, not a personal failing, but a cosmic truth. I woke with a gasp, the taste of dust and stale air in my mouth, the dream's impossible geometry still burned behind my eyelids. The low thrum of my instruments was a comforting anchor, pulling me back from the precipice of that impossible vista. My body ached. Yet, as I poured myself another lukewarm mug of instant coffee, my gaze drifted back to the screens. The signal, patiently waiting, seemed to pulse with a renewed intensity, a silent invitation. And despite my rationalizations, a tiny, unsettling seed of doubt had taken root, a faint tremor beneath the surface of my determined resolve. The world above, with its insistent sun and its clamoring faces, had become a distant, irrelevant hum, a static I no longer wished to decipher. Days blurred into a single, extended vigil. My fingers, stained with graphite and the faint sheen of sweat, danced across the console, tracing the signal's contours. It was not merely a sequence of pulses, it was an architecture, a language built of pure relation. I saw it first in the unexpected symmetries, then in the unsettling asymmetries that resolved into a deeper, more terrible order. A series of recurring motifs began to emerge, not as simple repetitions, but as echoes that twisted back on themselves, each iteration slightly altered, a fractal unfolding into dimensions I could barely grasp. This was not the physics I knew, the elegant, predictable dance of particles and forces. This was something else entirely. It was a geometry that defied Euclidean space, a pattern that seemed to curve inward upon itself, implying structures that could not exist within the familiar three dimensions I inhabited. My mind, usually a fortress of logic, felt as if it were being gently, inexorably, stretched. I remember the insistent chirping of my satellite phone, a shrill interruption to the mind's profound quiet. It was a colleague, his voice tinny and distant, asking about a grant proposal, about my absence from a departmental meeting. The world above was a frivolous distraction, its concerns gossamer threads compared to the leaden weight of this discovery. My work demanded absolute focus, a purity of intention that allowed no room for the mundane. Besides, how could I explain what I was seeing? The pattern was recursive, yes, but it was also non-Euclidean. Imagine a line that, when extended, does not merely continue, but curves back upon itself, intersecting its own origin in ways that defy linear progression. Or a surface that holds more space within its boundaries than its apparent dimensions would allow. This was the nature of the signal's underlying structure. It was not just a code, it was a blueprint for a reality that folded and unfolded in impossible ways. My equations, once so solid and dependable, began to feel like flimsy paper cutouts against the vast, shifting tapestry this signal was revealing. I sketched frantically on my illuminated tablet, the glow reflecting in my bloodshot eyes. Lines that should have been parallel converged. Shapes that should have been distinct bled into each other, forming new, impossible geometries. The more I worked, the more the conventional frameworks of physics seemed to buckle under the strain. Sleep became a luxury I could not afford, a weakness that threatened to pull me away from the precipice of understanding. I barely recognized the man staring back. This was not Arthur Caldwell, the esteemed astrophysicist. This was a man consumed, a vessel for a knowledge too vast, too alien, to be contained. The signal was not merely transmitting data, it was rewriting the very code of my awareness, subtly shifting the parameters of my reality. The world above the mine, with its simple, predictable dimensions, felt increasingly like a fading dream. And I was afraid, not of what I would find, but of what I was already becoming. The cold, persistent drip from the abandoned mine's ceiling was the only clock I acknowledged, its rhythm a morbid counterpoint to the quiet hum of my instruments. It started subtly, like dust motes dancing in the periphery of my vision, too fleeting to grasp. The metallic sheen of the ventilation pipes would seem to ripple, as if reflecting water that wasn't there. I dismissed them, my will a bulwark against anything that might distract me from the truth I was certain to uncover. My coffee mug, a chipped ceramic vessel that had been my constant companion for weeks, began to shift. One morning, the faded floral pattern seemed to writhe, the petals curling inward like dying insects, the leaves elongating into sinuous, skeletal fingers. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and the mug was ordinary once more, innocent in its porcelain stillness. Another time, the intricate circuitry on a receiver panel appeared to rearrange itself, the tiny wires and resistors forming fleeting, impossible geometries before settling back into their familiar, ordered chaos. Was my mind playing tricks? The most unnerving manifestation, however, was the pervasive sense of being watched. Even in the deepest recesses of the abandoned mine, where no living thing other than myself dared to tread, I felt eyes upon me. Not physical eyes, but a vast, indifferent scrutiny that pressed in from the granite walls, from the very air I breathed. I would spin around, my heart thudding against my ribs, expecting to find what? Nothing. Only the familiar rock face, the silent machinery, and the spectral hum of the signal. The isolation, perhaps, was fostering these waking dreams. I needed a tether, a voice of reason. I decided to contact a colleague, a fellow astrophysicist whose pragmatism I respected. I powered up the satellite link, a rare indulgence, and initiated a video call. The face of the senior researcher appeared on the screen, framed by the familiar, sterile glow of his office. He looked tired, his eyes betraying the weight of administrative duties. Arthur, the senior researcher greeted, a flicker of surprise in his gaze. Good to see you. Everything all right down there? I hesitated, searching for the right words, for a way to articulate the crumbling edifice of my reality without sounding unhinged. The work progresses, I began, my voice rasping from disuse. But I've been experiencing some unusual phenomena. Visual distortions. A strange sense of environmental flux. The senior researcher tilted his head, a frown etching itself between his brows. Environmental flux? The mind's stable, isn't it? No seismic activity? No, nothing external, I clarified, my hand clenching into a fist. It's internal. Objects seem to shift. Patterns rearrange and I feel. A different colleague, a younger analyst, leaned into the frame, his expression a mixture of curiosity and concern. Observed, Arthur? A presence that isn't physical. It's as if the very air is watching. The senior researcher exchanged a quick, meaningful glance with the younger analyst. Arthur, he said, his tone softening, you've been down in that mine for a long time. Weeks, isn't it? The isolation, the lack of natural light. It can play tricks on the mind. You need to come up for air. Take a break. But the signal, I protested, my determination flaring. The data is critical. I'm on the verge of a breakthrough. We understand that, the younger analyst interjected, his voice gentle, almost patronizing. But your well-being is paramount. Perhaps a few days away from the equipment, a chance to rest your eyes, clear your head. They didn't believe me. They saw a man unraveling, not a scientist grappling with an unthinkable truth. The truth of a reality that was no longer static, no longer safe. Frustration coiled in my gut, hot and bitter. How could I explain that the distortions weren't a symptom of my fatigue, but a consequence of the signal itself? That the signal wasn't just data, but a lens, warping the world through which I perceived it? That won't be necessary, I said, my voice firm, though it trembled slightly. I'm fine. Just an unusual reaction to the prolonged focus. I'll continue my work. I ended the call abruptly, cutting off their concerned protests. I blinked again, and they were gone, replaced by the blank screen. I was alone again, truly alone. The line between wakefulness and dream had not merely blurred, it had dissolved, leaving me adrift in a shifting landscape where reality was a malleable thing, constantly reshaped by an unseen hand. I was determined to understand, to pierce the veil, even if it meant sacrificing the last vestiges of my own sanity. The signal awaited. The screen, a cold, dead mirror, reflected nothing but the gloom of the abandoned mine. My colleagues' faces, those fleeting, distorted masks of concern and pity, still swam behind my eyelids, their features elongating, eyes blackening into abyssal pools. I blinked them away, forcing the image from my mind, but a residue of their grotesque mockery clung to the periphery of my awareness. Something else, a pressure, a thrumming beneath the very bedrock. I ran a hand over the rough-hewn stone wall beside me, the grit cooled beneath my fingers. This place, my sanctuary, my clandestine laboratory, now felt less like a refuge and more like a sealed tomb. The air, usually stagnant and thick, seemed to prickle with an unseen energy. My equipment, a haphazard array of custom-built receivers and antiquated processors, hummed its familiar song, but even that sound felt different, infused with a subtle, discordant tremor. I stared at the main console, at the oscillating waveforms that painted the alien signal across the display. A thought, sharp and unbidden, sliced through my concentration. It watches from a place beyond light. The words were not my own. I stiffened, my breath catching in my throat. Nothing. Only the familiar, unsettling quiet. My rational mind, a fortress I had built brick by painstaking brick over decades, immediately sought explanation. Fatigue, I told myself, the relentless pressure of this work, the isolation. A trick of the mind. These were currents of pure concept, flowing directly into my consciousness, bypassing the intricate machinery of my auditory system. They were like the faint impressions left by a hand pressed against wet clay, a fleeting, formless understanding of something vast and ancient. They spoke, not in words, but in a language of pure geometry, a syntax of impossible angles and dimensions that twisted the very notion of space within my mind. I closed my eyes, pressing my palms against my temples, as if to physically bar the intrusion. But it was useless. I saw a cube, yet it possessed 7 faces, each one perfectly flat, yet all simultaneously convex. A sphere that contained its own exterior, an endless folding inward that somehow presented an outward surface. My stomach churned, a primal revulsion warring with a terrifying intellectual fascination. The membrane thins. Another thought, stark and terrifying, pierced the veil. The rough stone before me seemed to ripple, the rigid lines of the timbers blurring, then reforming into outlines that were subtly, terrifyingly wrong. A corner of the mine shaft, where rock met ceiling, appeared to fold inward upon itself, creating a visual paradox that made my eyes ache. I gripped the edge of the console, knuckles white. This was no longer a signal to be decoded, a puzzle to be solved. This was a direct, intrusive communication, bypassing every known sensory channel, every cognitive defense I possessed. It was a violation, an uninvited guest charting the very pathways of my thoughts. The entity was not merely sending data, it was touching my mind, impressing its alien reality onto the delicate machinery of my consciousness. A wave of nausea washed over me, but beneath the fear, beneath the profound sense of being utterly exposed, there was a spark, a burning ember of intellectual defiance. This was unprecedented. This was the ultimate frontier. My colleagues, with their well-meaning caution and their limited understanding, could not fathom this. They saw madness, a breakdown. I saw revelation. I saw the true, horrifying face of the cosmos, staring back through the conduit I had unwittingly opened. I forced my trembling hand to the keyboard, my fingers hovering over the controls. The signal pulsed on the display, brighter now, almost luminous. But I was also driven, a relentless current of determination pushing me forward. I had to understand. The abandoned mine, once a shield against the world, was now a crucible, and I, Arthur Caldwell, was caught in its infernal heat. The flickering lantern cast long, dancing shadows, making the rough-hewn walls appear to writhe. I had come too far, sacrificed too much, to turn away from the precipice. My makeshift station, a jumble of repurposed electronics and salvaged wiring, hummed with a low, expectant thrum. I adjusted the dials, my fingers numb but precise, coaxing the raw data into a semblance of order. Each click of the frequency modulator, each subtle shift in the amplitude, was a step deeper into the rabbit hole. The screen, a salvaged display from a defunct industrial unit, glowed with a sickly green luminescence, displaying waveforms that rippled and fractured like shattered glass. Hours bled into a seamless stretch of concentrated effort. My eyes burned. Tracing the intricate patterns, seeking the hidden key. The signal wasn't merely a sound, it was a tapestry woven from incomprehensible mathematics, a language of pure concept. I felt it not just in my ears, but behind my eyes, a pressure building at the base of my skull. It resonated within my bones, a low, persistent vibration that seemed to realign the very atoms of my being. I was no longer merely observing, I was becoming a conduit. I isolated a particular harmonic, a resonant frequency that had been buried beneath layers of static and noise. As I amplified it, the waveforms on the screen began to contort, stretching into impossible geometries. The green light pulsed, bathing the mind shaft in an eerie, rhythmic glow. The air grew heavy, thick with an unspoken presence. I leaned closer, my breath catching in my throat. The screen flickered violently, not with static, but with something far more unsettling. The data wasn't forming an image in the conventional sense, but rather a perception, an imprint forced directly onto my consciousness. It was a vastness, yet utterly devoid of dimension. Not the emptiness of space, but the absence of anything comprehensible. My mind reeled, struggling to categorize what I was witnessing. It was less a form and more a fundamental negation. Its form was the terrifying realization that everything I understood about shape and substance was a quaint, human delusion. It was the lack of form, the ultimate dissolution, the concept of non-being given horrifying, immeasurable scale. My human-centric worldview, a fragile construct of comforting lies, shattered into a million glittering fragments. The universe was not merely larger than I had conceived, it was fundamentally alien, governed by principles that actively defied my every instinct for order and meaning. I felt a profound insignificance, a crushing realization that my existence, the existence of humanity, of all life, was merely a fleeting, accidental ripple on the surface of an unfathomable, timeless ocean of that. But the signal, now a roaring torrent, had already breached the dam. I was no longer just Arthur Caldwell, the astrophysicist. I was a witness, and my mind, now irrevocably tainted, was a doorway. My mind, a frantic engine of denial, screamed for obliteration. I scrambled, clumsy and desperate, through the narrow passages, the lantern swinging wildly, its beam a frantic eye darting over slick rock and skeletal timber. I did not look back, could not afford to. The ascent was a blur of frantic handholds and burning lungs, fueled by the singular, overwhelming imperative to escape, to unsee, to undo. The night air, when I finally burst free, was a cruel, mocking bomb. It carried no solace, only the vast, indifferent hum of the world. My car, a silent metallic shell, waited. The drive back was a fugue state, the familiar winding roads transformed into a labyrinth of meaningless lines. Headlights of passing vehicles seemed like predatory eyes, the distant town lights a false promise of sanctuary. Home. My study, once a sanctuary of ordered thought, now seemed a tomb. The heavy oak door swung shut behind me with a soft thud that resonated through the floorboards. Moonlight, thin and spectral, pierced the window, illuminating the stacks of printouts, the blinking lights of my servers, the very instruments that had become conduits for the unspeakable. I began with the papers, snatching them from the desk, my hands clumsy with urgency. The crisp edges felt alien, imbued with a malevolent intelligence. I piled them into the fireplace, a pyre of forbidden knowledge. A match flared, a tiny sun against the encroaching gloom, and the first corner of a page curled into ash, then flame. The fire caught, orange tendrils licking at the scientific notations, the spectral charts, the carefully calculated anomalies that now screamed a different truth. Next, the hard drives. Each one a repository of the signal, the algorithms, the simulations that had cracked open the universe's skull. I seized a hammer, its weight comforting in my trembling hand, and brought it down with savage force. The plastic casing shattered, exposing the delicate platters within. As the last shard of data scattered, a subtle shift occurred. The ambient light in the room seemed to waver, not from the dying fire, but as if the very air had thickened, grown opaque. A book, a heavy tome on quantum mechanics, slid from its shelf with a soft thud, landing open on the rug. My gaze snapped to it, then to the shelf. No tremor, no breeze. It simply moved. They began to stretch, to undulate in the corners of my vision, not following the faint moonlight or the embers' glow, but with an independent, sinuous grace. They elongated, reaching like phantom limbs across the walls, coalescing into forms that had no name, then dissolving back into the general gloom. My breath hitched. The walls themselves, the sturdy plaster and timber of my home, seemed to flex. I had to leave. I spun, stumbling towards the door, my hand reaching for the brass knob. I twisted, pulled, but it remained locked, stubbornly refusing to turn. I tried again, a desperate wrenching, but it was as if the mechanism had fused. My eyes darted to the windows. Heavy, old-fashioned sashes, they too seemed sealed. I pressed my palm against the glass, it hummed with a low, resonant vibration. A subtle pressure built in my ears, a silent roar that threatened to split my skull. I was trapped. Not by locks or bars, but by something else, something vast and unseen, that had finally claimed its prize. The signal. It was a resonant thrum, a vibration deep within my skull, a chorus of impossibly vast, silent voices that spoke without sound, conveyed meaning without language. Each throb was a directive, an urge, a certainty that pulsed through my veins. I was not merely following a hypothesis, I was being guided, pulled deeper into the mind's maw, into the very earth that seemed to hum in sympathy with my internal clamor. The lantern swung, throwing grotesque phantoms ahead of me, stalactites like grasping claws, fissures like gaping mouths. Yet, these distortions were not frightening, they were familiar. The mine was not just rock and dirt, it was a living, breathing conduit, a physical manifestation of the signal's reach. I could feel its ancient, patient pulse beneath my feet, a rhythm that had waited millennia for this moment, for me. Closer, I murmured, the word a dry rasp against the damp air. My voice felt distant, as if someone else spoke through my lips. The entity, or whatever it was, had long ceased to be an external phenomenon. It had burrowed into the core of my being, unraveling the very threads of my perception, reweaving them into a tapestry of its own design. Logic, once my sanctuary, had become a cage, and the bars were now dissolving. A sudden tremor, subtle but insistent, vibrated through the rock face beside me. The air grew thick, heavy with an almost palpable presence. Here, the rock was different. It was a vortex, a miniature galaxy etched by geological time. Reveal/discovery, this was it. Not an artifact, not a message, but the very structure of the Earth responding to the signal, mirroring its cosmic geometry. The patterns pulsed, not with light, but with a silent, profound energy that only I could perceive. It was the universe speaking through stone, a language older than stars, and I, Arthur Caldwell, was its interpreter. I was its vessel. The signal wasn't just from the cosmos, it was the cosmos, a consciousness so vast, so indifferent, that it didn't merely observe reality, it was reality, shaping it, bending it, and now, through me, manifesting it. My mind, once a citadel of reason, was crumbling, its stones scattering to become part of this greater, terrifying architecture. I dropped to my knees before the swirling rock face, my lantern clattering and dimming as it rolled a short distance away. They were not merely patterns, they were instructions. My hands, trembling with a frantic urgency, began to scrape at the earth floor before me. The signal demanded a connection, a physical bridge. I dug, oblivious to the sharp stones tearing at my fingertips, the dirt caking beneath my nails. My movements were clumsy, desperate, driven by an imperative that transcended all sense of self-preservation. The form. The us. I pressed my ear against the cool, damp earth, listening for the deeper hum, the subterranean current that would complete the circuit. The voices in my head swelled, a cacophony of impossible frequencies, yet perfectly coherent, perfectly me. Arthur Caldwell was gone, dissolved, a mere memory. What remained was a conduit, a receiver, a piece of the vast, terrifying machinery of existence, deep within the abandoned mine, waiting for the final, irreversible connection. My sanity had not merely unraveled, it had been meticulously deconstructed, then reassembled into something utterly alien, utterly complete. I was the signal. I was the mine. I was the collapse. My ear, pressed against the cold, damp bedrock of the abandoned mine, felt the low thrum more acutely now, a resonance that vibrated through bone and marrow. It wasn't the rumble of distant earth or the sigh of subterranean wind, it was a pulse, vast and slow, echoing from beyond the stars, yet now undeniably here, within the very rock beneath me. The shiver that had seized me earlier intensified, blossoming into a full-body tremor, not of cold, but of a profound, electrical awakening. My vision, previously swallowed by the mind's impenetrable gloom, began to shift. It was textured. These were not reflections, nor was there any visible source. A gasp caught in my throat, a sound lost in the immense, silent expansion occurring within my skull. My thoughts, usually a relentless current of theories and calculations, began to fragment. Arthur Caldwell, astrophysicist, was a name that felt suddenly distant, a label for a fleeting, inconsequential form. I tried to grasp it, to anchor myself to the familiar contours of my own mind, but the current was too strong. It wasn't a hostile takeover, not precisely. A wave of understanding, not my own, washed over me. It was a perception of scale, a comprehension of distances that made light years feel like mere inches. I saw, not with my eyes, but with an internal gaze, the intricate dance of nebulae collapsing, the slow, agonizing birth of suns, the quiet consumption of galaxies. These were not images recalled from textbooks or telescope feeds. They were lived experiences, ancient and indifferent, flowing through me as if I had always been privy to their eternal unfolding. Panic flared, a tiny, desperate spark in the vastness. My name. My work. What was a single life, a single consciousness, against the backdrop of cosmic entropy? The damp earth against my cheek felt less like soil and more like a single, infinitesimal node in an unimaginably vast network. I was seeing the universe not as an observer, but as a component. Then came the clarity, terrifying and absolute. It was not Arthur Caldwell seeing these things. It was a portion of it, experiencing through Arthur Caldwell's senses. My identity was not being erased, it was being assimilated. I was not a vessel, I was a newly integrated facet, a tiny, intricate lens through which a boundless consciousness could briefly focus on the granular details of a single, insignificant world. The thought brought a strange, horrifying peace. My struggle to remain Arthur was futile, a rebellion of a single neuron against the entire nervous system. I tried to move, to stand, to break free from the silent embrace of the abandoned mind, but my limbs felt heavy, less my own. A profound weariness settled over me, the exhaustion of having glimpsed the true scale of existence. The air itself seemed to thicken, pressing down with the weight of unimaginable time. My breath came in shallow, ragged gasps, but even that felt external, a function of the dissolving organism I still inhabited. My internal landscape, once a familiar terrain of memories and ambitions, was now a boundless expanse, dotted with the faint, glittering echoes of unimaginable events. Arthur Caldwell was fading. His memories were becoming distant echoes, his fears mere ripples on an infinite sea. What remained was a heightened sense of perception, a raw, unfiltered conduit to a reality too vast for any single mind to grasp. I was a point of resonance, a fleeting expression of something ancient and eternal, forever bound to the cool, damp earth of the abandoned mind, listening to the universe hum through my very bones. And in that hum, I heard not a message, but a vast, silent roar of indifferent existence, and I was, terrifyingly, a part of it. The low thrum, which had been a distant echo, now surged through the bedrock, not merely vibrating against my ear but permeating the very air of the abandoned mine. The cold, damp stone against my cheek was a conduit, channeling something immense and ancient directly into my core. My vision, already dim in the subterranean gloom, began to waver, the rough-hewn walls of the tunnel blurring into a shifting tapestry of shadows. I pushed myself harder against the rock, as if trying to merge with the source, to understand its language through direct physical communion. Then, the world shattered. Not with a bang, but with a silent, blinding influx. I saw, not with my eyes, but with a raw, unfiltered consciousness, vistas that defy geometry and light. Galaxies, not as shimmering islands of stars, but as ephemeral patterns in a greater, unfathomable current. They were motes of dust in a cosmic wind, not majestic structures, but fleeting, accidental configurations in a vast, indifferent ocean of pure potential. My understanding of space, of time, of causality itself, fractured and reformed into grotesque, impossible shapes. I perceived dimensions folded into one another, not abstract mathematical constructs, but tangible, living realities that writhed and coiled around each other. The universe was not expanding into emptiness, it was a single, immense, sentient thing, constantly reshaping itself, shedding and growing, utterly oblivious to the fleeting sparks of life that briefly ignited within its inconceivable depths. And within this horrifying panorama, I saw humanity. A microscopic bloom of consciousness clinging to a forgotten speck of rock. Our triumphs, our sorrows, our grand narratives of progress and meaning, they were less than the momentary ripple on the surface of a puddle, gone before the next raindrop fell. All my life, I had sought to understand the cosmos, to map its grandeur, to find our place within its equations. Now, the equations themselves were revealed as childish scrawls on a blackboard in a universe that had no blackboards, no chalk, and no need for the concept of understanding. The entity, or what I now understood to be its fundamental nature, was not a being in any sense I comprehended. It was the process itself. Not a creator, but the very fabric of creation, a constant, churning, evolving state of pure existence that simply was. Its purpose was not a goal, not an aspiration, but an intrinsic function, like the slow, inevitable grinding of tectonic plates, or the ceaseless decay of an unstable isotope. It had no will, no malice, no benevolence. It simply unfolded, and in its unfolding, worlds were born and annihilated with equal, passionless indifference. My mind reeled, a fragile instrument overwhelmed by the sheer bandwidth of this revelation. The concepts I had built my entire identity upon, reason, observation, the scientific method, dissolved into childish fables. There was no truth to be uncovered, only an unending, ungraspable is. My brilliance, my reclusive dedication, my meticulous pursuit of patterns and the cosmic static, all became a cruel, cosmic joke. I was a gnat attempting to measure the ocean with a single drop of dew. A scream tore from my throat, but it was not my own. It was a primal, wordless sound, ripped from the collective unconscious of a species suddenly confronted with its own utter irrelevance. My body convulsed, a marionette whose strings had been severed. I clutched at the bedrock, my fingers scraping against the rough stone, desperate for something solid, something human, to anchor me. But there was nothing. Only the thrum, now a symphony of silent, terrifying truth, resonating not just in the mind, but in the deepest, most terrified chambers of my soul. The communion was complete. And what remained of me was a vessel overflowing with the raw, unvarnished horror of pure, unadulterated existence. The pickaxe, still clutched in my numb fingers, felt like a forgotten relic, its purpose dissolved by this new, overwhelming reality. My breath hitched, a ragged gasp caught in the rising tide of the sound. My vision blurred at the edges, the rough-hewn walls of the mine shaft seeming to melt and reform, their shadows lengthening into impossible geometries. The single lantern I had brought cast a sickly, wavering light, but even its feeble glow felt insufficient, swallowed by the profound, resonant darkness that now pulsed around me. No, I whispered, the word a fragile leaf against a hurricane. It was a plea, a denial, a final, desperate attempt to anchor myself to the familiar. But the thrum ignored me, deepening its hold, asserting its primeval claim. It was not merely sound, it was a presence, vast and indifferent, pressing against the very architecture of my mind. Concepts, memories, the very language of my understanding, all began to unravel. My name, Arthur Caldwell, became a foreign utterance, a meaningless combination of syllables. The intricate equations I had once cherished, the elegant symmetries of the cosmos, now seemed like child's scribbles, utterly inadequate to describe the Leviathan truth that now asserted itself. The signal. It wasn't a message from something, but the echo of something. And I, in my hubris, had reached out to touch it, to pull it into the confined, comprehensible space of my intellect. Now, it was pulling back, not with malice, but with the unthinking force of a tide against a sandcastle. The universe was not merely vast, it was porous star. My consciousness, my very sense of self, was a fragile construct, a fleeting ripple on an ocean of incomprehensible scale. The signal was not an entity to be understood, but a fundamental characteristic of existence itself, a deep-seated hum beneath all perception. It had always been there, waiting, a silent chord vibrating through the eons. My knees buckled. It was in my bones, my blood, the very marrow of my being. My individual thoughts, once so precious, began to dissolve, melting into a larger, more ancient awareness. I was no longer Arthur Caldwell, the astrophysicist. I was a vessel, a conduit, a single, infinitesimal point within an oceanic resonance. I felt the immense, slow turning of galaxies, the birth and death of suns, the indifferent dance of cosmic dust. There was no joy, no sorrow, no purpose in this vastness, only an unending, cyclical hum. My fear, once a sharp, insistent thing, now flattened, became meaningless. How could one tiny ripple fear the ocean? My eyes, I imagined, were wide and unblinking, reflecting the lantern's glow as if from a great distance. The fight was gone. The struggle was over. There was only the thrum, and me, absorbed into its boundless, horrifying peace. Days later, or perhaps weeks, the team of searchers found the entrance to the abandoned mine. The air above ground was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and distant rain. They found the equipment first, the sophisticated receiver, the modified antennae, the jumble of wires and salvaged components, all neatly arranged on a makeshift table near the shaft's end. Beside it, stacks of notebooks, filled with meticulous observations, complex calculations, and increasingly frantic, indecipherable scribblings that spiraled off the pages into abstract patterns. And then, they found him. He sat cross-legged on the floor, perfectly still, his back against the rough-hewn rock. A thin layer of dust coated his clothes, his hair, even his eyelashes. His face was devoid of expression, smooth as polished stone, yet it held an unnerving tranquility. No flicker of recognition. His gaze remained distant, unseeing, utterly absorbed. One of the searchers, a grizzled old miner, pointed to something on the makeshift table. A small, crude speaker, still humming faintly, despite the power source being disconnected. From it, a low, resonant thrum emanated, so subtle it was almost imperceptible, yet it filled the confined space with an ancient, insistent presence. It was the signal, captured, amplified, and now, a constant, quiet whisper in the heart of the abandoned mine.